Everything's set, so whenever y'all are ready, if you want to sit down and be quiet.
We're ready to go?
Just start whenever you want, yeah.
All right. Katie, welcome.
Thank you.
So, I want to tell everyone how me and you have met. We actually don't know each other for that long, do we?
A few months, yes.
I ended up selling your house.
You made me a millionaire, yes.
I did, made you a millionaire, a whole $300,000 millionaire. But, so while I was selling your house, we ended up getting pretty close, and we talked a lot. And I thought you would be the perfect first guest for this podcast that doesn't even have a name yet.
Right.
So I think this is going to be a really good one. So
Yeah.
with that, are you ready?
Well, it's something that, I have never shied away from. And so, I've always kind of talked about it in ways, even in a grocery store, if I find somebody that, is receptive and they seem to be looking for something, and I can break a conversation with them, I do. Because why not? I have nothing to be ashamed of. And, God saved me. And so, with that being said, if I can do anything to help somebody else, that's my job.
Sweet. Well, let's jump into it. So, tell us where you were born. What was your childhood like?
So I was born around the Vidalia, Georgia area. My childhood was really great to begin with. I was, for some odd reason, I was my daddy's favorite, but I think he had a sixth sense. I think he knew that at some point I would need what he was teaching me. And so, he was a Baptist preacher. He was much older. He was 61 when I was born. And so by then he had retired, but he still preached, as a guest preacher. And so at the age of 4, my mother walked into the room, and, I can't really remember much about her. That was my real first memory, was that she walked into a room and she gave me a handful of bottles, or it seemed like a handful of little bottles, and said, "Here, this is your fault." And so I took them to my daddy, and all I know was that hell broke loose, and they left the house. And then later, I understood or realized, or maybe heard bits and pieces, that she had tried to commit suicide. And so, in retrospect, looking back at that, she set me up with that statement of it was my fault to save everybody. And so I became the savior of the world.
When you say that happened, did y'all left the house? Did they get a divorce, or did they stay together?
No, they stayed together for a few more years, and then there was a divorce. And when the divorce happened, my father was in the hospital, and some neighbors had gotten very friendly with my mother, and they played a part in it. I don't know how, but they played a part in it. But at any rate, while my father was in the hospital, she divorced him, and so he never came back to that house, and we moved. And then my mother ordered her a man out of the back of a magazine. Because, that was the time back then. And so she got a real winner. It was a man that had real problems. He had come out of prison. And later in life, I found out he was a habitual violator. He was a drug addict. He was a thief. He was just trash, to be honest. And, then he decided that, he was, I call it the little man syndrome. and it had something to do with his size. It really did. He felt very inferior. I could sense that in him, and I could feel it. And so that inferiority, he took it out on beating her, and I would intervene.
How old were you around this time?
I was probably 9 years old, and so I would try to step between And then, he would attack us. He would beat us. I had a brother and sister older than me. I ended up having a brother and sister younger than me. But as the middle child, I was the one that had suffered the trauma, and I was the one that became the savior. And so my job was to take care of them, and my job was to take care of my mother the best that I could. Even though she was very cold to me, none of that mattered. I was dispensable in their eyes, but I really wasn't dispensable. And so I think I must have been maybe 9.5, and they would split up off and on. He would go to prison, and he would spend time in prison, a few months, or in jail or whatever, and he would return. And so he was gone, and some neighbors had moved in, and she became friendly with them, and they were about her age, a couple. And I recall hearing that they didn't have their children, that their children was in an orphanage in Alabama, and this was in South Georgia. We had moved to South Georgia, and so I was too young to understand that. But my mother and his wife decided to go to the movies one night, and he was going to babysit in his home. And so it was, we had to go to a bedroom, we had to lay down to go to sleep. What woke me up was something that was happening simultaneously. So there was somebody beating at the front door, and he was performing oral sex on me. And so I was asleep, and I woke to both of those things, and I'm thinking, I'm going to kill him, but I don't know how. And so immediately the beating on the door stopped it, and we left immediately. I didn't tell anybody, because what was the point? Nobody was going to do anything. And so we went home. I don't know what the time frame was, but his children showed up. They got their children back, and I was forced by my mother to go back to that house with her. And he immediately said he wanted me to spend the night with his daughter. And I kept saying no, and my mother kept saying yes. And so I was left there. And his wife wasn't there, she had left. And so he had a daughter my age. And immediately he said, I'm glad I've got you tonight, and I'm going to do some things to you that you will never forget. And I ran to the door, hit the locks, and was screaming, and he was screaming, come back, come back. And I took off running. And I ran home, and I must have been 9.5 maybe, or so. And I'm beating on the door, and my mother opens the door. And she said, what are you doing here? And I said, get out of my damn way, I've got a headache. She never challenged me. I went straight to my room. And in retrospect, did she know? Probably so. It probably was a setup, but that's okay.
Who was beating on the door when that was originally happened to you? You said someone was beating on the door, and then you went home.
Yes, that was my mother and his wife coming back from the movies. And so they were beating on the door to get in.
And they never wondered what was going on in there? Or do you think they...
I think they knew. I think it was a setup. And so, life didn't get better. It actually just kind of got worse, That man she had married would cycle in and out, and he had cycled back in, He would take and beat me with his belt. He'd pull his belt out. He'd wrap it the wrong way. He'd beat me with the buckle. And so I would have black eyes. I'd be bruised all over. And, nobody said anything. Nobody. The whole world looked at it and said nothing. But, I did. I came out of the room one day. I And I don't know how I reached that power. Maybe it was just a breaking point. But I came out of the room after he had beat me with this buckle, and I said, I will never be beat again. If this ever happens, I will call the police. And nobody said anything, but it did. It happened again. You know, it wasn't long. He hated me, which was fine because the feeling was absolutely mutual. And I was the bigger target out of everybody. And so I wasn't allowed to sit at the table with him to eat. And neither was my brother, who was 2 years older than me, and he was mentally slow. And so I took care of him. And so we had to sit at the kitchen counter to eat. And the table was right there, you know, close by. And my mother said to me to get up and get my younger brother some water. And I said, okay. I said, let me finish doing this, whatever it was, preparing my food. She didn't say anything. She didn't say yay, nay, nothing. So obviously, you know, I thought it was fine. And it was just brief, very brief. I stood right up, and when I turned around, you know, I didn't realize he had gotten up. He had. And he hit me with his fist upside my head as hard as he would hit any man. And I couldn't see. I couldn't see anything. But I reached behind me. He turned his back on me. I reached behind me to the butcher knife drawer and grabbed the knife. And I leapt on his back. I wrapped my legs around his waist. I wrapped the arm around his throat. I had the butcher knife. And I would have killed him. I would have killed him, and I would have been glad that I killed him. So the police was called. The police came in. They held me off of him. And I don't know what they did with him, but he left the house that night. And the next day, my father lived about 3.5 hours away. And I was sent for the summer to stay with him. Me and my brother, that was 2 years older, went to stay with him. Okay. I didn't tell my father what happened, because if I'd have told my father, I would have lost my father, because my father would have killed him. And I didn't want to lose my father too, even though I rarely saw him. And so you know, life just kind of went on. And, you know, I knew I didn't suffer any serial consequences right then for what I'd done, other than, you know, the beatings, which always happened. But I just felt in my soul there was going to be deeper consequences for what I had done to him. And so there reached a point that, you know, he was in prison and he needed to be paroled out. My mother had had a child by him by this time, and they wanted to parole him to the house that I lived in, and they knew that would be an impossibility. I don't think it was because of caring for me as a person. It was that they needed him to have a place, and I was dispensable. And so, you know, things began to happen. We were in a town 7 miles away, and I was 13 years old. And, you know, it was late in the evening. It was my half-brother, who was much, much older, was in the hospital. And that's the reason we were there. And so it was his home. And I said, you know, can I go to the movies? It's $0.25. And I actually had $0.25 because I'd actually started working at probably maybe the age of 9. I would cut grass, I would edge sidewalks, I would do whatever it took to make some money so I could eat. And so in the back of a magazine, I found an advertisement for Blair products. I wrote to them, and they sent me a magazine to sell out of. So I would sell door to door. I'd sell grit papers. I would sell whatever I could in order to have a little bit of money to eat, because I was being deprived. And so
How did you do working? How'd you do working? Did you make pretty good money?
I did good, and maybe it was that people looked at me and said, "Poor child." I don't know, but I was a hard worker. I was dedicated, and so I did whatever it took.
You originally had started with, you had asked if you could go to a movie.
Oh, yes, the movie. And so reluctantly she agreed. And I went. I walked to the theater. It wasn't very far. I walked to the theater and I saw the movie. And there was friends I went to school with there. And so there was a boy that was my age that rode me home on his bicycle. I rode on the handlebars. And I got back to the house, but I had him drop me at the street corner. And I walked on down the street, and when I got there, the house was locked, and nobody was there. There was no lights on. They had left me. And so I'm in a strange town, I'm about 7 miles away. I'm 13 years old. I don't know what to do. And so I do have a background from my daddy of knowing God, knowing that there is a God, knowing that you can call on Him. Being in church when I was little, which I was no longer in church, but a song was "Jesus Loves Me" from Sunday school that I just could not ever escape. I knew that song, and that song meant something to me. And so, I know that God was there. I know He was there. I know He saved this child. And I walked across town in the dark. There wasn't a whole lot of street lights back then. There wasn't a whole lot of traffic. There wasn't a whole lot of people around, so I was alone in the dark. And I walked to a house across town that I knew the girls that lived there, and I knew the parents. I went to school with them, and they were actually friends of my mother. And so I knew not to go to the front door because the parents would know. So I went to the bedroom window where the girls' bedroom was and beat on the window, and they opened the back door, and I went in. And so I spent the night there that night. The next morning I got up. Of course, I had on the same clothes I'd worn to school the day before, which was not unusual, but, I hadn't bathed, nothing. So I went back to school that day with those same clothes on. I went home that afternoon on the bus, and when I walked in, nothing was ever mentioned. Nothing was ever mentioned that they had left me. Nothing was ever mentioned about how I survived or what I did. But my mother was very out of control. She did not know. She didn't know how to buy groceries. She didn't know how to do so many things. She was very irresponsible, and I knew that we had to eat. And so I guess at the age of maybe 11, I had started going with her to the grocery store, and I would have to control what she could. I would have to encourage her to put stuff back or encourage her not to do this or not to do that. Let's just limit it to one time. Yes, you can have whatever it is you want, but you can't have it all the time. We'll starve. And so I had a measure of control that I didn't like, but I had no choice. And so, the consequences of what I had done to that man was, coming. And I knew it was coming. It had already started with being abandoned. They were wanting to send him home. And so we were in the grocery store one day, and I never had a childhood. So I never had the experience of having friends or any of those kind of things. And we were in a grocery store, and a girl, or two girls I went to school with, was there. And they didn't really like me, which was fine. They didn't dislike me. I didn't really even know them. But they asked if I could go to their house for the afternoon and, just kind of hang out with them. And I asked, and my mother said yes. And so, strange that would be allowed, but I went. I was very uncomfortable in that household. And so I left, and I had to walk across town probably 5 miles to get home. And when I got there, a deputy sheriff was waiting on me, and I didn't understand. And he said, "You disobeyed your mother, and you're out of control, and so you're going to jail." And so he arrested me. So he arrested me, and on the way to jail, he said, he couldn't put me in the back seat because he had dog food in the back seat, so I was in the front seat. And he said, I think I'm going to take a little exit right here in the woods with you. By then, I was a little smarter. And I said, you do that, and I'm going to tell my daddy, and my daddy's going to kill you. And he decided that wasn't a good idea because my daddy, everybody knew my daddy. He was a nice man, he was a kind man, but everybody knew he was not somebody you mess with. And so I was taken to jail. And I stayed there until the next afternoon. The next afternoon, I was taken to the closest regional youth development center, which was, I don't know, a couple hours away maybe. And I got there, and I was locked down. It was crazy. It was unreal. But it was my life. And, on the flip side of that, though, was I had food. I had whatever I needed, but I did not have my brothers and sisters that I was so worried about because who was taking care of them, what was happening to them. And so I was allowed to go back home briefly, and I don't really remember what even transpired, but the next thing I knew, I was arrested again, and he had to come home. They had to get me out of there, and I was dispensable. And so I was locked in the Regional Youth Development Center again. I was taken to court, and in the courtroom, actually, I was in the Regional Development Center, and the court service worker, who was a godsend, and his name was E.B. Lamb III, and Mr. E.B. stepped in. He knew my family, he knew my relatives, and so I went to live with one of my uncles, and E.B. lived in the area, so E.B. made sure I was okay. I couldn't tolerate I couldn't tolerate the life there with my aunt and uncle. And so I wasn't sad that I went. They sent me to the State Youth Development Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And so when I got there...
Before we get to that, I do want to wrap back around.
And the house was empty. That was my older half-brother's house,
Okay.
which was 7 miles away
Okay.
in that small town. And so they had just packed up and went back home, because they were going to go home that night. But, they weren't going to leave me there, certainly. And certainly, they were going to wait until I got back from the movies, which I think ended like at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock maybe even, but they didn't. And so, when I was sent to the state youth facility, Mr. E.B. would come to Atlanta to see me, and I was okay. And I knew I'd be okay under his care. And then he came one day and he said, they have transferred me. And so this is the last time that I will see you, Katie. And this is who will be taking over for me. And her name was Lola B. Vaughn. And I actually think the B stood for bitch, because that's what she was. I knew I didn't stand a chance in hell with her. And so I knew that if I wanted to survive, I better do something. And so I did. I ran away. And me and another girl. And I guess we were gone for maybe 12 hours or so. I was arrested was picked up, the police saw us on the street and knew, because it had been sent out that we were runaways. And so I was taken back, and I knew going back that I would be locked in a cell. And so I was taken to the 3rd floor, and they had cells on the 3rd floor, and they were just steel doors with a little cage at the bottom, no windows, very little light coming from the hallway, only a commode. And I don't recall any bedding at all, to be honest. There may have been, but, I knew I'd be locked down for 7 days in that room. And after that 7 days, then I would be transferred to a hall where I'd be locked into the hall, and I wouldn't be able to leave for 2 weeks. I wouldn't be able to go outside at all. And so, I spent that first 7 days locked down, and this was the second time because this was my second runaway. So I was locked down, and when I got past that first 7 days and they put me on the hall, I was very cunning and very smart, and I figured it out. And so I ran away again, and I climbed a 6-foot barbed wire fence with the barbed wire going around the top. And so I was cut up, my clothes were ripped, and I ran into the woods, and I was able to avoid the guards. I was able to avoid law enforcement. I came out on the interstate somewheres in Atlanta, and somebody picked me up.
How old were you when you were going through all this?
I was 14.
Yeah.
14. Yes. And so, I knew nothing. This other girl was with me, though, and she was kind of street smart. And so she kind of knew some things, I guess. And so she told the guy where we were headed, and she told him we were headed to Peachtree Street, which she was familiar. She was from Atlanta, so she knew. I came from a rural area. I had no idea. And so he said he was headed to a ball game. He took us there. He dropped us off. And we were hitchhiking and got picked up. And so thank God it was an honorable man. And he took us there. He dropped us off. And, we're lost. We don't know what's going on. And I had seen a picture of a runaway at that state-run facility prior. And there was somebody on the street, and I recognized her. And her name was Carolyn. And I hollered, and her head turned, and I said, "That's her." And I told her, I said, I came from where you came from. And I thought there might be some help from her because, she had been out there a long time. But it turned out that wasn't exactly the case. And so that night, the police stopped us, but I was very smart. And so when you ask ages and identification and names and birth dates and what year were you born, and you've got to give all this information very quickly, very rapidly, or if they know you're lying. And I was able to do it. I could figure out the dates really quickly in my head. And so, they arrested her because she couldn't come up with it, and I did. And they said, "You're free to go." And so I was happy that I was free to go. But this girl, Carolyn, introduced me to another woman. I was young. I had no idea what was going on in life. And really at that point, I don't know that I even cared.
What was going through your head just throughout your entire childhood when all this was going on from?
I don't know that there was a lot of anything going through my head other than next step, survival step, next step. And I knew it was outside of normal, but I also knew that there was a lot of shame attached to it, a lot of stigma attached to it that I didn't deserve and had nothing to do with me. And so I would not accept that. I wouldn't accept the stigma of it. I wouldn't accept that it was my fault, because it wasn't. You know, I had a very strong personality, and that strong personality came, I think, from a lot of the trauma. And then a lot of it came from the way my daddy had talked to me when I was little, when I was a child. So many things he had said to me that made me strong. So many things, because he had told me when I was 5 years old, you know, honey, they might can kill you. They cannot eat your soul. And I remembered that. And I don't know why he told a child that. And it didn't matter, because in retrospect, I don't think he was telling me. I think God was telling me through him. And so, you know, I stood on all of the little things that I had heard from him. And I stood on that somewhere, somehow, God's there, and he's going to see me through this. And that was all I could cling to. But when I was in Atlanta and I was locked in that cell, I was so alone and so broken. I was broken but unbroken, if that makes sense. And so I was crying out to God as I was curled in a fetal position in a floor locked away, and I felt something. And I felt something very deep, and I knew that I wasn't alone. And that's all that I needed, to just know that I was not alone.
What was the feeling?
You know, it was like something just covered me. Something covered me with a warmth, with a caring, that I knew that I would survive it, and I would not let it engulf me, no matter what. And so that was what kept me going. And I'm lost again. And that happens. Unfortunately, that does happen, because it all becomes such a one-dimensional blur that it's hard to keep that timeline straight. It's hard to go from trauma to trauma to trauma to trauma to trauma, but you have to survive it, you have to get through it. And so I was living on the street. This Carolyn introduced me to this woman. Her name was Ruby. She was a black woman. Seemed very nice. I was young. I had no idea, nothing. Didn't know what was going on in life. I was panhandling for food, you know, and I would just, you know, I'd say, do you have a spare nickel? Do you have a spare dime? You know, I need food. And people would hand me money, thank God. And it wasn't like it is now. Now you see people everywhere wanting something. This was not the case back then. This was the case back then, that people actually needed it to survive. And so, you know, Ruby Tutton told me, she said, you know, I have an apartment, and you can stay in this apartment. You will be fine. And you can come to where I work at. And so I did. I went to where she worked. And where she worked was in a bar. And so they allowed me to go in the bar. I didn't know what a bar was. I had no idea. But they allowed me to go in and sit. And they would bring me Cokes and stuff to the bar. And all the people that worked there was very friendly. And then I understood, because I was there later. And I understood, but I didn't understand. So Ruby would take her clothes off to dance. And so it was actually a strip bar. And I couldn't make any kind of judgment call on that at all. I didn't have the capability of making any kind of judgment call. They asked me to do it, and I said, no, absolutely not. And so, you know, Ruby continued to be what I thought was a friend, until one night, you know, there was a walk-in closet in her apartment. And that's where I was placed. And so she had sold me. And so there was a line of men, one after another, I had been drugged. I was drugged, but I still knew what was happening. And so I lost consciousness. And when I woke up, I was in a stairwell. They had taken me to an apartment building and abandoned me in a stairwell because they thought I was dying or had died. And people were walking around me coming down the stairs. And, you know, a man came along coming down the stairs and rescued me. I thought he had rescued me. And so, you know, it turns out he was very kind because I was very ill. I was very sick. And he did take me home. He did get me well. And then the next thing I knew was, I didn't understand it at that time. I understand it now. He sold me. And so the very kind man that got me well sold me to somebody else. And so I was taken to Byron, Georgia, in a car. They were going to the Jimi Hendrix Festival. I knew nothing about drugs. I knew nothing about anything really other than survival. And so when we got to Byron, Georgia, the driver of the car had said to the other people in the car, do not come back to this car today because it will be being watched. All vehicles will be being watched here today. And there was drugs in an air horn. And the man had said, these are where the drugs are, do not come back to this car. And later that afternoon, and everything was a blur. Everything was a complete blur. And later that afternoon, when we came back to the car, all of a sudden, we were surrounded by men that had assault rifles that looked like hippies. They were dressed that way. The van that pulled up to get us. So these men jumped out of a van, out of the side door of a van with assault rifles. And, you know, it looked like a hippie van. I didn't know what was happening. We were thrown into the door, into that van. The door was closed. And here we were with all these men with assault rifles. And that's when they identified who they were. And it was law enforcement. It was the GBI. It was the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And so I was under arrest for drugs. And they took us to Interstate 75, where we were transferred to the Peach County Sheriff's Department. And we were taken to jail in Fort Valley. And so on my side of the jail was two other females and me. And you could hear from the men's side. And so I heard a man saying he wanted an attorney. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew if he wanted one, I wanted one too. And so I said, I also want an attorney. I want an attorney. And so the following day, the same deputy, his name was Johnny, I believe, came back and said, oh, there's a lawyer wants to see y'all. And so I'm taking you to the lawyer's office. And so he did. He took us to the lawyer's office, and he took all three of us females to the lawyer's office, and his name was Mr. George. And, you know, he said he would help us, and he would do whatever he could. And so he asked for our stories, you know, and all the details and stuff. And, of course, I lied. And so I said that I was from Atlanta, and they wanted to know where I had lived where I lived. And I said I lived at the Salvation Army because I knew there was a Salvation Army there. And I kind of knew where it would be located in case I was asked. And so I lied. And so he started working on everything. And, you know, he told me, he said, what I will do is I will have the deputy bring y'all every day to the office here, so you do not have to stay in jail. And so every day, the deputy would take us to Mr. George's office, him and his son's office. We would go there. We would hang out with the secretaries, just kill time, whatever. But they were making arrangements for all of us to leave the jail and move on. So every afternoon, when the deputy would come and pick us up, Mr. George would have him take us to a restaurant for dinner, and he would pay for it. And so that was our daily ritual. We would go there, we would stay at his office, we would go to dinner, and while they were making the arrangements. And they were making arrangements for the other girls as well. And so one day, because I am not a liar, and I am not a cheat, and I'm a very honest person, I went in one day and I said, Mr. George, I have to talk to you. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, I just need to talk to you. And he said, come on in. Closed the door, and I did. And I sat down across from him, and I said, I've lied to you. I've not told you the truth. I've not told you who I am or where I'm from. And I have to do that. So I did. And he said, honey, I'm so sorry. He said, your mother must be so worried because, of course, she would know that you had run away. And I said, she's not worried. She doesn't care. And he said, no, honey, you've misunderstood. And I said, no. And he said, well, we need to call her. And I said, okay. And so I walked around the desk where he was at with the phone, and he called her. And I just stood there at the desk, and he talked to her. And he got off the phone, and he said, honey, I'm so, so sorry. He said, I am so sorry. He said, but I will take care of you. I will be here for you. He said, and of course you know. And I said, yes, I know. I have to go back. I know that. And he said, so I'll take care of it. And I said, okay. So he did. He contacted them and made arrangements. And so one of the guards from there and his wife was coming to pick me up. And they came. But that night, I'd never had anybody really that had ever done anything really for me that I could recall. And they held a party in that office. And there was gifts. And the guard came and his wife, and Mr. George paid for our dinner for them to stop and for me to have dinner on the way back. And he faithfully wrote me weekly, sometimes multiple times. And it wasn't one page. It would be multiple pages from a very kind man that had no reason other than he was a godly man to help me and to look out for me. And so being back there in Atlanta and them knowing that I had an attorney made a difference for me there in that home, because there was a riot and everything I owned was destroyed, and the state was not going to do anything about it. And Mr. George stepped in. And when he stepped in, they had to take me to Lenox Mall in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had a shopping spree. And the shopping spree was paid by the state. And so, thank God I had him. And he did everything that he could for me and was always there. And his secretaries. Every week I got letters from his secretaries. And he kept money on my books. So if I needed anything, and I could get it. And so I was very grateful and very thankful. And so there came a day that I was able to go home. And so, I had to make a decision. And the state, my social worker did not want me to return. And her husband was a lawyer, and they did not want me going back home because she knew. And I knew that I had to go home, though, because my brothers and sisters, I had no idea what was happening to them. And I felt a responsibility. I had been given that responsibility by my mother with those pill bottles to look after the world, to save the world. And so there was a lot of really great opportunities that were offered to me by the social worker and her husband. And so I had been offered a contract, a modeling contract, and I said no. I had no idea. All I knew was I needed to get home. They had submitted my pictures, and then they also had made arrangements for me to go to Vashti in Thomasville, Georgia, which is sort of a boarding school kind of thing. And I said no. And there was a place in Tallulah Falls in North Georgia, and I said no, I have to go home. And so that's what I did. I went home to take care of my brothers and sisters, and when I got there, you know, it was difficult. It was very, very difficult. I was back in the home with a woman that didn't have the capacity, I don't think.
How old were you at this time?
I was 15.
15.
When I returned.
Did Mr. George say what she said on the phone when he called her?
He did not tell me what she said, and he didn't have to. Yeah. You know, I knew it wasn't going to be good, or it wasn't going to be positive. And that it would be very obvious. It had always been very obvious. But I don't think she had the capacity to do anything more. Yeah. So I returned home. I was taking care of my brothers and sisters. I went to summer school that summer because I had not been in school in a very long time, but it didn't matter because I was extremely smart. And I am self-educated, really. And so I did the summer school because it was a requirement for me to go home to do that. And so I did the summer school. And then when it was time for me to enroll in school in the fall, I did. I enrolled. I went 2 days, I think it was, and my mother tried to commit suicide. And so I called an ambulance for her. She was taken to the hospital, and of course, you know, I'm the adult in the house at 15, so I have to go to the hospital. You know, I have to deal with, you know, kids that's not in school. I have to deal with kids that are in school, and I have to deal with her being in the hospital. And so she refused to come home. And back then, they didn't throw you out of the hospital. They didn't tell you got to go. And so she was in the hospital, in the local hospital, not a mental hospital, not a rehab hospital, nothing to do with suicide, a regular hospital for about 6 weeks. And so when she finally came home and I returned to school, the principal said, no, you cannot come back. You can't come back now until next year because you've missed so many days this year. And I was 15. And she said, well, in that case, you've got to find a job because you have to pay me to live here. And I said, oh, okay. And so I tried to find a job. And I couldn't find a job, but I had a boyfriend. And the boyfriend, I went to school with his brother. I knew him. You know, I knew of him all my life, kind of. And so we realized, because my mother said, you know, if you can't do this, if you can't get a job, if you can't pay me, you will not live here. I will have you arrested.
Even after you took care of the house for the 6 weeks she was gone.
And so I had no choice and couldn't find a job. And so my boyfriend, his name was Beanie, and he said, I will pay this. I will pay this. And so he did. He paid her religiously. And the day I turned 16, we got married. And I wasn't pregnant. So a lot of people thought that. And
how old was he?
He was 19. He was fixing to turn 20, which nowadays would be frowned upon. You know, but the truth is we were very close in age. You know, we were 4 years apart.
What was the year that all this was going on? I know you don't like me dating you, but...
This is 1972. And so, you know, we got married, and of course I don't think his family was very happy about it, but it didn't really matter. And so we were married about 6 months. So a year and almost a year and a half after we'd gotten married, I gave birth to my son. And, you know, we were fine. except for, my husband Benny was young, and he started drinking, beer here, beer there, hanging out with the boys, or not even really hanging out with the boys, but just outside, mechanicking on something on, a motorcycle or whatever, and they would be drinking beer. And, not every alcoholic sets out to be an alcoholic. And he didn't set out to be an alcoholic, but it grabbed him. It grabbed him, and he became an alcoholic. And so I saved the world. And so I hid it. I hid it from everybody. And he was a weekend alcoholic. He had a job that required that if they found out, he would have been gone. And he needed that job. We needed that income. And so I hid it for that reason, but I hid it for a lot of reasons. And, a few years later, I had my daughter. And, I kept hiding it. I kept hiding it. And so eventually, my children were the most important thing in the world. And there was not a moment that they didn't know that they were loved, always. And I know sometimes I looked like an idiot. I'd be 100 yards from the bus when they were getting on the bus, and me screaming, I love you, I love you, I love you, because I wanted them to know. I wanted them to always know. I wanted them to always feel that, and that they could turn to me for anything, and that I would be their protector. And I was. And so, after being married for 18 and a half years to my husband, I was tired. I was very, very, very tired of hiding it. I was very tired of he wouldn't get help. I was very tired of the whole thing. And I was very tired of having to be a babysitter. And I wanted a life of my own. I wanted something for me. And so, I applied for some jobs, and I came in next to a person that was a chemistry graduate for a job. And I got a second interview with them. They got the job, I didn't. But that's how smart I was. And it was at the hospital, and I said, if I come that close, I can do whatever it is I want to do. And so, I went to work for an insurance company. And my husband became very jealous, very jealous. And, it was going downhill very quickly. And I knew that, if it didn't turn around, there'd be a divorce. And
Did you not work for the 18 years y'all were married?
For that 18 and a half years, I did work. I worked a few times, like, for somebody that we knew. She baked cakes, and so, I helped her for a while. I would do things that, was approved by him. But when I got into the public, he was concerned about the men. He became very jealous. And what I said was, I'm not stupid. I am not stupid. I know exactly how life is and how people are. And so I came home from work one day, and it had been very, very erratic. I would get a phone call, and he would double check. He would call my friends to say, did you call her? So there was that kind of thing going on. And, things that he had done prior for me, I would ask him, could you fasten my necklace for me this morning before going to work? And he would say, get your boss to do it. And I'd say, yep, okay, not a problem. I can do that. And so I came home from work one day, and he wasn't there, but my son told me, who is now 17, he told me, he said, Daddy filed for a divorce today. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay. And so I packed some bags, I put them in my car, and I waited on him to get home. And when he came home, I just said, I heard what you did. And so I'm going to leave for a few days, and the kids are here with you. And I don't know that he had ever been this ugly to me, but he said, bitch, don't leave with my car. And I thought, wow. And so I left, In a couple of days, I went to see the lawyer that he had filed with, who we both knew. And I went to see him, and he told me, he said, Katie, he said, he has dropped the action. And I said, okay. And he said, what he wants is for you to quit your job now. And I said, so, okay, he dropped it. I pick it up now. I said, so I'm filing. And he said, yeah, Katie, but. And I said, no. I said, after 18 and a half years, if he doesn't know who I am, I don't need him. I said, because I know who I am. And so I picked it up. I got the divorce. The paperwork had been done wrong. And so when I got before the judge and they were reading the paperwork, I was like, no, I'm not signing on to this. I'm not signing on to this. I'm fixing to get screwed here. And so...
What did it say?
Well, the amount of money had been cut in half. And so I told the judge, I said, I'm not signing that. I'm not doing it. And he said, well, if you can get him to sign this, sign the change and sign it, and you can be back here before 3 o'clock this afternoon, I will see you, and we will do this thing. And I said, okay. And so I found him, and he didn't want to sign it. But at that point, I don't think he had much choice. And so he did. He signed it. And he actually rode with me to the courthouse. He would not get out of the car, but I went in and saw the judge. And the reason I wanted him in the car was in case there was a problem. And so I got the divorce, and I left. And I continued working and, doing everything that I could. I had gotten an apartment. Our house was already being closed on. We were in the process of selling that house and in the process of buying another house. And, of course, that buying of that house stopped immediately, and the selling of ours went forward. I didn't go to the closing. I didn't have to, and I still trusted him. And so I trusted that he would bring me what was owed to me. And did he do it? No. So, he paid off his new motorcycle first, which, was no benefit to me. And so there was things that, But I said, that's okay. And so I had a cousin that was a lawyer who was a state solicitor. I went to see him. And I said, and this was right prior to the divorce. And he said, yes. He said, you're absolutely deserving. He said, but I'll tell you that legal fees will probably run around $10,000. And I said, if he can live with it, I can live without it. And that's what I'll do. And so that's what I did. And he was very bitter for, several years. But, I understood his position, and I would not let that bitterness get into me because it wasn't going to serve any good purpose. And so I just kind of went dead, really. But, really, in all reality, I'd probably been dead for a long time. But emotionally, I was not dead when it came to my family, my children, and the public in general. Anybody that I saw that I thought could benefit, just from a word. I tried to do that because I know how bad it is when you have nobody. And so, I was working for an insurance company.
All right, Katie, we are back from the break.
Okay.
Where we left off at, you were 34 years old, just divorced, newly single mother of 2. But before we get into that, I do want to ask you a little bit more about your father.
Okay.
I know you said your father was a great man, and throughout your childhood and your teen years, sounds like we mainly had to deal with your mom and the guy she was dating. I would love to hear more, and I'm sure the audience would also like to hear more about your father. Kind of where was he at during all this? I know he was older when you were born.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how long after. Hopefully he was around for a while, but I'd love to hear kind of memories you had with him.
Okay. So when my parents divorced, things were much different back then. So I was 61 when he was born. There was a 30-year age difference between my father and my mother. And so I didn't see much of him because he was so much older, and he lived in a much more rural area than where we lived. And then, as soon as my mother hooked up and married the deadbeat, we moved away. And so we moved to South Georgia, which was probably maybe 3.5 hours away from him, 3 to 4 hours away. But during that time, there was a time that she was still married to this man, and he had abandoned us. And so we were living in a very rural area. Obviously, he must have run out of money and run out of food. And so we were literally starving. And I guess she had sent a letter to my father, because my father shows up one night. And, he's much older now. And so he has somebody driving him. And so he has a driver bring him. And they're looking for the house because it's in a rural area and they can't find it. And they run across story that we're destitute and we're starving. And so the State Patrol actually arrives first before my father. And the officers get out and they have bags of food. And so, we know we're going to eat, which was great because it'd been a long time. And so, it wasn't very long before my father arrived, and he packed up our household and moved us back to closer to the area where he was at. As a matter of fact, I go back, he actually moved us into the same house. He had split the house where he would have one side and my mother and us would have whatever we needed, the rest of the house, And so he had did that, and we stayed there for a little while. But at any rate, going back to my father, because the age, because the distance, I didn't see a lot of him. And so when I was sent to Atlanta, he didn't even know. Because, there was no communication really. There wasn't phones and all that kind of stuff, There was no social media and all those things. So it was just basically word of mouth. And eventually he found out. But he talked about it in the letters, and I knew it was hard for him. And I didn't want him to know how hard it was for me, so I never told anybody how hard it was for me. There was no point in it. It served no purpose to really hurt other people or to make them feel really bad when there was probably nothing they could do. And so I kept it to myself. But he also knew he had made me very strong. And it is my strength. But my strength, I know, comes from God. It doesn't come from me. And I know because of singing that song, Jesus Loves Me, that is what saved me. That's what brought me closer to God. That's what brought him there that night to comfort me. And once you find that with him, he is always there. And, you may not see him, and that's fine. You don't have to see him. You can feel him. And you can actually, if you listen, and you really, really listen to your mind, and you really pay attention, you will know. You will know, and you'll feel it. And you will get messages from him. And I know that sounds strange, but it's absolutely the truth. And so today, there are things that I was given I guess, spirits of discernment. And so there are things that I know that are outside the ordinary and outside of normal that I can speak to before they happen, which, has been devastating at times. But it also gives me a very clear path sometimes. And so, I don't know how it happened or where it came from, and it's not important. The only thing is important is that I know I have that relationship with him, and that has been a saving grace for me. And the saving grace for me is there's no shame in any of this, because this was not any of my doing. This was the outside world. And so why would I be ashamed? I'm proud I'm a survivor. I'm proud I walked through the fire. And when I walked through that fire and come out the other side, he gave me a strength that is unbelievable. People can do whatever they want to do, but they'll live with it. And I will survive, and I am like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And I will always be rising, always.
Did your father ever keep to meet your children?
No. So my father, he was full-stage Alzheimer's by the time my son was born. And he had been put into a nursing home. And so my son was about 1.5 years when my father passed away. And so, to be totally honest, in the funeral home, it was all I could do not to crawl in the casket with him. And had I not had that son, I would have crawled in the casket. But that baby is the only thing that kept me from doing that. Because the one thing that I knew I could hold on to always was his love, and it was going in that casket. But, he did. He died, he passed, he went on, and I survived. And I always knew I would survive. My mindset was I would never let anybody else win, never. I'm a winner, and I will always be a winner at whatever cost it takes. I will not let the world destroy me, and I won't let the people in it destroy me. God gave me a strength that is insurmountable.
Did your mother ever try to, after you got married and had children, did she ever try to re-enter your life, try to get to know the kids?
I never left her. So I got married to Benny. Excuse me. I got married to Benny. We got married January the 14th, 1972. The day after I got married, I picked up my brothers and sisters, took them home with me. I kept them at my home most of the time. And then one day, I happened to wander up to my mama's house. I'd been there just a couple of days before, or a day before, hadn't heard nothing about any of this. And we go to my mother's house, and it's around the beginning of March that year, so we'd been married maybe 1.5 months, maybe 2 months. And there's a truck, and the furniture's on the truck, and they are leaving. I had no idea. And they're not just moving down the street, they're moving 3.5 hours away. And I'm upset. I'm very upset, because I see those brothers and sisters not as hers, but as mine. I'm the one that took care of them. I'm the one that raised them. And now she's taking them somewhere where I will not be able to be sure they're okay. And so I was very angry, very, very angry. I was angry that this was hidden and there was so much deceit in it and conniving. And so I told her, I said, I want to talk to you outside. And we went outside, and I said, let me tell you something. You're taking them away where I can't see them and where I don't know. I said, you didn't take care of me. You never protected me. I said, and now you're going to try to destroy them. I'm not going to allow this to happen. And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, you absolutely know exactly what I'm talking about. And she never said another word about it. We turned around, we went in the house. They packed, they left. That was in March. As soon as school was out for them, I got them. I brought them home with me. I worked in tobacco with them that summer. They earned their money for their school clothes. And of course, they didn't have enough, but we paid the difference, Benny and I did. And, life just went on. And I would go, we were young, we were poor, but, the money we had could have been spent so much better, but it couldn't be because I had to make sure that my mind was clear and that my heart was clear and that they were okay. And so whatever we could do, we did. So when Christmas came around, they had Christmas. And it was because we supplied the Christmas. We supplied whatever needed to be done. And so I never left my mother per se. I was never blinded by anything to do with her. I was never blinded by it. And I was well aware of who she was, and well aware of all the bad things. However, I also had to look at, and it took me a long time to get to the point of looking at who she was and where she'd come from. And so at any rate, my father ended up in a nursing home because he was full-blown Alzheimer's. And I was there when he went into a coma. And he had a stroke and went into a coma. And immediately I was there. And they made me stay outside. And it was like 11 o'clock at night. I'd been in and out all day, and all of a sudden, they don't want me to come in. And I'm on the front porch of the nursing home, and I know my half-brother's in there, and he was already in there, and that's the reason he's getting to stay. But then my half-brother came out and told me my father had died. And so, at the funeral home, like I said, I really wanted to go with him, but I couldn't because I had another responsibility, my son, which was a good thing. It was a saving grace. He saved me in ways.
Why do you think your mother was the way she was? Did she ever talk about how her childhood was that led her?
So yes, she did. When I was very young, she would tell these little stories and things that I remembered. That she said that her mother died when she was 2, that she had a stepmother that was very mean. And so the way my father and mother met was my father was a farmer and a preacher. He had a wife. He had a son that was grown and, essentially grown. And so my mother lived in Marietta, Georgia. My father lived in Middle Georgia. My mother's father had run an ad in the Farmer's Almanac that she would be a helper for somebody. And so my father needed a caregiver for his wife. His wife was ill. And I don't know everything about that. I just know that she was very ill. I know that they had to have a caregiver for her. And so he went to Marietta. He got my mother and brought my mother home to be his wife's caregiver. So my mother came there to be the caregiver, to take care of his wife, and she did that until she passed away. And when she passed away, my father married my mother. And so essentially, when you go back and you look at time and places and things, and back in those times, I would say that my mother probably was sold to my father as some kind of helper. So I'm sure there was a money exchange. And it was a few years ago, and this was something I was going to tell you earlier. So a few years ago, I was coming from Gainesville. I had been to see my acupuncturist, and I was on my way home, and I was listening to Ed Sheeran's Rain. And if you listen to the words of Rain, I thought, my mother may not have really had too much blame in this either. She was very dysfunctional. What did she know? She didn't know how to deal with all of life's casualties. And there she was, very young. She really essentially had been sold off. She didn't have a family. And there she was. She had my sister that was older. She had my brother that was older. And, and then there was me. And there was 3 kids. For a young woman that is stuck, really, and has nothing in life. And so maybe when she gave me those pill bottles, even though the damage was done to me, and it hurt me tremendously, but maybe that was her pain, because she had to have had pain from her life. And maybe that was her only way of dealing with it, was by pushing that pain off on me and blaming me. And so I absorbed the blame. But I do give grace where grace is deserved. And I think that maybe she deserves some grace. And so I give her that.
Do you think there was a part of you back then that may have knew that, and that's why you never cut her off completely and stayed around?
I don't really know why, but I do know that I lived in Atlanta when she was fixing to die. And I had talked to her. I always talk to her. And I had talked to her. And when I got the call from her doctor, I got it from my desk at work. I got my stuff. I walked out the door, and I just said, I'm leaving, I'll be back. And I left, and, I left Atlanta, and I wasn't thinking about anything really other than just getting to Moultrie, Georgia as quick as I could, and it was a long drive. And so I was stopped because I was speeding. And so it took me longer to get there, and it cost me a lot of money to get there, but it was okay. But when I got there, and they took my license, and said I couldn't drive on Interstate 75, and I said, watch me. I'm going to a hospital in Moultrie, Georgia. So whatever we have to do, we're going to do it. I'm going. And he said, you can't. He said, you can't drive. I got your license. And I said, I don't care. And he said, not going to allow it. And I said, well, I will walk right down to this way station right here on 75, where I have now stopped directly by them for this very reason, and I will get somebody to drive me. And he said, no. He said, I'm not going to watch you pull off then. He said, so you do what you got to do. I said, I'm going to do what I got to do. And so I got back in my car, and I went to Moultrie. And when I got there, the doctors told me, she's waiting on something, and we're sure it's you. And so now she can go. And so I said, okay. And so I thought that probably was the case too. And this was on Monday. And by Tuesday, she hadn't passed. And she was on the life support. And so I said, take the life support off. And so they did. They removed the life support. And, I just said, it's better this way. And so I'm in the room with her, and the doctors are telling me she's waiting on something, and I'm there. And so I realize she probably is waiting on my brothers and sisters, who is not going to come at all. And so I told her, and there was a minister in the room and a preacher, and he was not happy. But that was okay. I didn't really care if he was happy or not. I told her, I said, listen, I understand, and I know all of this was not meant to be, and you're so sorry for it, and that's fine. I said, I have no hard feelings. I said, I love you, and if you see a light, go to it and follow it. And I told her, I said, I know you're waiting on something. I said, so I'm just going to tell you, everybody is here. I said, you probably don't remember. They've been in the room. I said, and they're all downstairs right now. I said, and every one of them loves you. And I got up and I walked out the door, but the preacher disagreed with me immediately and said, you shouldn't be lying. And I said, you deal with what you got to deal with. I'll deal with what I got to deal with. I walked out the door, and I didn't even make it to the corner in the hall before somebody come running and said she just passed. And so with her passing, I came apart. I never come apart for very long, though. So I came apart for a few hours, and then I just kind of regrouped. We said, this is the way life is. So, I had to deal with the aftermath. I had to deal with everything she had left behind that was chaotic. I had to deal with brothers and sisters that were different than I was, much different. As much as I did for them, as much as I tried, they were different than me. They cared really nothing about life. They really cared nothing about people. They really, very selfish, and that's fine.
Did they have to go through the same stuff you did as a child? Did they have similar upbringings?
No, because I took the brunt for them. But that being said, I'm sure there was trauma in their life and for them of different kinds. And so, I had a brother that was 6 years younger than me, and he was my baby. And, and he treated me like I was his mother. And, I was always there for him. And then he got angry at me. And, people get angry, and that's okay. And, we'd been there before, and it was something he wanted, and I wouldn't do it or whatever. And so we had not talked for a while. And I was in Walmart. And his birthday was the next week. And something told me right there in the garden department, bake him a cake and call him or just show up. And I didn't do it. And the following week, he dropped dead. He had a massive heart attack at the age of 44. And, I just picked up the pieces and said, I will do what I have to do. And so I paid for his funeral, almost all of it. And I said, because nobody else would help me, and at that point I really didn't give a crap. I just said, I had always given him a home, and I would give him his final home. I would give him a resting place. And that's what I did. And so, I have a brother in Arizona. I have a sister in Arizona. I wouldn't waste a dime to call either one of them, honestly. You don't get to pick and choose your family. And so I didn't get to pick and choose. And I am of a different caliber than they are. And I'm a much different person than they are. And so I choose to align with what suits me, what fills me, what helps me, not what something is. If it's negative or detrimental to me, I don't want it around me. I don't want it in my life. I'm very selective about that. I try to be. at all times.
We've covered a lot in your so far the short part of your life.
Yes.
So I think we got a good feeling of kind of your father, dug in deep to your mother. So let's go ahead and jump back forward. So